The cabin in the dark. It was supposed to be the perfect vacation, just 6 friends, a secluded cabin, and miles of untouched wilderness. No cell service, no distractions, just them and nature. The group had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape their stressful lives and reconnect in the quiet of the mountains. The drive was long, winding through dense forests and narrow dirt roads, but eventually, they arrived. The cabin was old, much older than they had expected, with weathered wood and a sagging roof. But it had character, and more importantly, it was isolated. The nearest town was an hour away, and there was no one else for miles. It was perfect. "Man, this place is creepy as hell," muttered Jake as he threw his bag down in the dusty living room. "But I kinda like it." "Don't be a wuss, Jake," Rachel teased, nudging him. "It's rustic. It's exactly what we wanted." Sarah, always the planner, was already unpacking groceries in the small, outdated kitchen. "It's fine," she said. "We're only here for 3 nights. Let's just enjoy the quiet." They each settled in, claiming rooms and exploring the creaky old cabin. Greg and Lisa, the couple of the group, took the master bedroom upstairs. Jake and Rachel chose the rooms down the narrow hallway, while Sarah and Tom, who had been best friends since childhood, shared a room near the living room. The first night was uneventful. They drank, played cards, and laughed until the early hours. The cabin was cold, but the fire kept them warm, and the isolation gave them a sense of peace they hadn't felt in years. It wasn't until the second night that things began to change. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the cabin bathed in darkness. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the old cabin creak and groan. They were all gathered around the fire again when they heard it, a faint, distant knocking sound. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice suddenly tense. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the window. But the sound came again, louder this time. "Knock, knock, knock." "I'll go check it out," said Greg, the most fearless of the group. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the front door, everyone else watching him in silence. The door creaked open, and Greg stepped outside into the darkness. The flashlight beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. He scanned the area, but there was no one there. "Nobody out here," Greg called back, his voice echoing in the stillness. He closed the door, but as soon as he did, the knocking returned, this time from the back of the cabin. "What the hell?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. "Who's out there?" They all moved together, slowly making their way toward the back door. Jake grabbed a fire poker, Sarah clutched a kitchen knife, and the rest stood in terrified silence. Greg opened the back door, flashlight in hand, and again, there was nothing, just the thick, suffocating darkness of the woods. "All right, who's messing with us?" Greg demanded, stepping out into the night. "This isn't funny." But no one responded. Only the wind. As Greg stood there, something changed. The air grew colder, and a strange, uneasy feeling settled over the group. It was as if they were being watched. Greg turned back toward the door, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't like this," he said, his voice trembling. "Let's just go inside and lock up." They all agreed, retreating back into the safety of the cabin. But as soon as the door was closed and locked, the knocking began again, this time, from the roof. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah cried, her voice on the edge of panic. "Calm down, it's probably just animals," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe raccoons or something." But deep down, they all knew it wasn't animals. The knocking was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was as if something was trying to get their attention. Or worse, trying to get inside. Hours passed, and the knocking continued, sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the windows, sometimes from the roof. It followed them no matter where they went in the cabin, always just loud enough to be heard, but never revealing what was causing it. By the third night, the group was on edge. They hadn't slept, they hadn't eaten, and the relentless knocking was driving them to the brink of madness. The once cozy cabin now felt like a prison, and every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice hoarse from fear. "I don't care if it's the middle of the night. We have to leave." "Agreed," Greg said, grabbing his car keys. "Let's pack up and go." They hurriedly threw their belongings into bags, their movements frantic and desperate. But as they opened the front door, they were met with a sight that made their blood run cold. Standing in the driveway, illuminated by the headlights of Greg's car, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long, bony arms that hung down past its knees. Its face was obscured by shadows, but they could see its eyes, two glowing, red eyes that stared at them with an intensity that pierced their very souls. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, stumbling back into the cabin. "What is that?" The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The knocking stopped. "Get in the car!" Greg shouted, and they all scrambled outside, diving into the vehicle. Greg jammed the key into the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. Come on," he muttered frantically, turning the key over and over. The figure was getting closer, its red eyes glowing brighter. Finally, the engine roared to life, and Greg slammed his foot on the gas. The car sped down the narrow dirt road, the figure disappearing into the rearview mirror. But even as they drove away, the sound of knocking echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder that whatever had been at the cabin wasn't finished with them. They made it back to civilization the next morning, exhausted and shaken. No one spoke of what had happened, not even to each other. But they all knew that something had followed them home. That night, back in the safety of their homes, they tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Not easily. And when it did, it was filled with nightmares of the cabin and that figure in the driveway. At around 3 a.m., Greg awoke to a familiar sound. It was faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock. His heart pounded as he sat up in bed, sweat trickling down his forehead. He turned on his bedside lamp, but the light did nothing to chase away the fear creeping into his chest. He tried to convince himself it was just a dream, just the wind against the window. But the knocking continued, growing louder with each passing second. Greg wasn't the only one. Across town, in their separate homes, the rest of the group experienced the same terrifying sound. Jake heard it tapping on his bedroom window. Rachel felt it reverberate through her walls. Sarah and Tom heard it echoing through their apartments. Lisa, curled up in bed, felt as though it was coming from inside the walls themselves. None of them were brave enough to investigate. They stayed in their beds, blankets pulled up to their chins, eyes wide with terror. They all knew the truth. The knocking wasn't going to stop. And they would wonder, in the darkest hours of the night, when it would finally come for them.
Don't forget to subscribe.